Night broadcast. I'm Jamie Blackett and I am the Deputy Leader of the Alliance. Tonight I want to talk about two of our policy initiatives. The first is on the question of the Scottish Parliament and how we need to see it working better. And the second, which I'll come on to in a minute, is the Clarity Act that many of you will have read about in the papers this week we are calling for. First, the Scottish Parliament. As you know, we are a fledgling political movement. We don't have any people in the Parliament, but we are working closely with the Tories, Labour and Liberal members, and we want them to become a more effective opposition. And I am horrified by the way that representative democracy in Scotland has, for the time being, been suspended. What I mean by that is that the BBC have undermined the Holyrood Parliament by allowing a party political broadcast every day by Nicola Sturgeon. I don't subscribe to the Billy Connolly school of thought, the we pretendy parliament. I didn't vote for it, but I think it has the capacity to be a force for good. Certainly, it enables more local accountability in Scotland. But at the moment, it is quite obvious that it isn't working, and Nicola Sturgeon and the BBC together are making a mockery of it. Why has the presiding officer allowed so many policy announcements to be made on the BBC rather than in the chamber at Holyrood? Why haven't the opposition parties done something about it? Frankly, what is the point of having a parliament if the debate is one-sided and on the BBC every afternoon? It undermines democracy and it undermines the Parliament. The point is this: if a journalist asks a question of Nicola Sturgeon, it is the journalist's question that is being asked. There has been outcry that these questions have not been ones that people want asked, and they have in the main been rather easy questions without any opportunity for supplementary questions to be asked. If an MSP asks a question in the chamber in Holyrood, it is very likely one of our questions. That is how democracy works. We email our MSPs and ask them to hold the executive to account on our behalf. That isn't happening, and the BBC needs to do some soul searching and really question why they are undermining democracy in this way by allowing Nicola Sturgeon to have a party political broadcast every afternoon. The second policy initiative for the Alliance for Unity that I want to talk about this evening is this question of a Clarity Act. We are calling on Westminster to take the threat of separation seriously. At best, we have the threat of another 4 years of wasted opportunity and neverendum in Scotland while we carry on going around this perpetual question of separation. At worst, Nicola Sturgeon may win a majority of the seats. She's unlikely, in my view, to win a majority of the popular vote next May and try to bounce the government into another referendum. We would like Westminster to take the threat seriously, not to pretend it doesn't exist, not to ignore it, and to close the argument down by doing what the Canadians did and have a Clarity Act, a Secession Clarity Act. There are 8 questions that need answering. And the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, and the Liberal Party all need to get behind this. It was the Labour Party who dropped us in this mess in the first place by failing to heed Tam Dalyell's words about devolution being a motorway to independence without any exits. It was the Conservatives who compounded the error by allowing a vote in 2014, a vote that was won decisively by the pro-union side by 10 percentage points, but nevertheless they failed to frame the debate in such a way that it was terminal, or at least once in a generation. They failed to nail down the coffin lid. They now need to do so. There are 8 questions that need answering. The first is the trigger. Nicola Sturgeon has claimed time after time that she has a mandate for another referendum because they have won the majority of the seats. So we must clarify the mandate. We cannot carry on with this never-ending without any clarity over what a mandate for a referendum would look like. Would it be that the pro-separation parties won 50, 60, 70% of the popular vote in an election? I don't know. But even in 2019, even in the election last year, they failed to persuade enough people to vote for the SNP or the Greens to prove that they should have a mandate. The second question, and this is a big one, is on the question of the franchise, and that is indivisibly linked with the question of citizenship. Now, David Cameron, for very good reasons, went out of his way to make it easy for Alex Salmond in the 2014 referendum. He said that if he gave them everything they wanted, 16-year-olds voting, only people in Scotland voting, the yes side of a yes-no question, that they still, and if they still lost, then that would be conclusive. Well, as we've seen, that hasn't worked. We now need to clarify things so that that cannot happen again. And the most disgraceful thing to my mind was that in 2014, Scottish soldiers, sailors and airmen serving their country were not allowed a vote on such a fundamental question. That would have been life-altering for many of them. They would have instantly become mercenaries in a foreign army if the separatists had won the vote. The captain of the Scotland football team is invariably down south playing for an English Premier League club. He would be denied a vote if next time round the same rules are applied. And yet a 16-year-old foreign-born national, a criminal even in a prison, would be allowed a vote. That cannot be right, and it cannot be allowed to happen again. There was a lot of talk about going back to 1707, to dissolving the Act of Union. Well, I have to remind you that in 1707, in the first 4 months of 1707, before the 1st of May, the Alien Act applied, which meant that Scots didn't have the right of residence, were unable to work in England or Wales. I'm not suggesting that we go back to that or we should go back to that, but it is a very valid point that citizenship would be up for grabs. There would be no automatic right to carry on holding a British passport. If Scotland voted to become a separate nation, surely we would then all have different passports issued. We would no longer, if our young people got into trouble travelling the world be able to call on a British embassy to help them out. It would all be Scottish after that. So the question of citizenship and allied to that, the franchise, would need to be clarified, as it is in most other unions in the world. Thirdly, the wording of the question. As I said, David Cameron went out of his way to be accommodating to Alex Salmond. The question, should Scotland be an independent nation, yes or no, is what barristers call a leading question. Most people's instincts would say, well, of course Scotland is a nation. We have our own rugby team, our own football team. We are arguing that the question needs to reflect the severity of the issue. The question should be, do you wish to remain in the United Kingdom or leave the United Kingdom? No other question comes close to being as accurate in what would be for everybody the most serious question of their lifetimes. The fourth question is on the question of threshold and turnout and the percentage. I believe, I'm not an expert on the SNP's constitution, but I believe it requires a 60% vote to change it. Most other countries in the world for this type of question would set the bar at 55, 60%, something like that, rather than 50%. And they would also include a minimum turnout. It cannot be that we sleepwalk into another separation referendum anytime soon without sorting this sort of thing out. Fifth, we need to address the democratic deficit in Scotland. Rural Scotland, outside the central belt, does not vote the same way generally as the people, particularly of Glasgow and Dundee. In my last broadcast, I posed the Dumfries and Galloway question. Why should someone in Dumfries and Galloway be dragged out of the UK against their will? Well, we believe that a Clarity Act could legislate for that quite easily. If we are going to dissolve the Union and set up a new country called Scotland, why do we have to go back to 1707, which incidentally was one of the most unhappy times in Scotland's history? Why not 1207, 707 even? The secession debate is spawning a number of other secession debates. And we have already seen Shetland, the council in Shetland, voting to take steps for self-determination. Vote Skexit, get Shexit, and a number of other exits as well. I don't welcome that. I believe that the people of Scotland should have solidarity, mutuality, share in the prosperity or share in the challenges that we face, just as we should with the rest of the United Kingdom. But there is no doubt that in the event of a vote for separation, there would be an indie postcode lottery. A Clarity Act would resolve that. It would allow for a second confirmatory vote, a people's vote, I believe Nicola Sturgeon called it in the context of the Brexit, so that the people of Dumfries and Galloway, the borders, possibly Edinburgh, Shetland, Orkney, would have the option of remaining within the UK. We shouldn't be surprised about this. They were, after all, independent principalities and kingdoms until the Middle Ages. The old kingdoms of Galloway and Bernicia, Dalriada, Pictland, all these ethnic differences are now being brought out now by the separation debate. We shouldn't be surprised about that, and we should do something about it. The last thing we would want is for a new Scottish nation to come into being without the principle of consent being applied. The sixth question, and this is often debated, particularly when the JERS figures come out each year, is on the question of the debt. It always amuses me. Well, amuses is the wrong word, isn't it? It should worry us all that the SNP always put up former Royal Bank of Scotland economists to make the economic case for independence. Well, we also saw how that ended in 2008. And it is the same characters who get in front of the cameras and argue that Scotland would be able to start again as an independent nation, to go out and borrow money on world markets without any debt. Well, I'm not an economist, and I don't know the full ins and outs of that argument, legal argument. But it seems extraordinary to me that the parliamentarians of England and Wales would allow that to happen. After all, the UK's national debt is at record levels. Why should we be able to walk away scot-free? And it seems even more extraordinary to me that those people are able to make that argument without clarity. That is another reason why we need a Clarity Act now. The seventh question is on the question of trade and the border. Well, again, if we were to go back to the status quo ante, it's a legal term for what went on before, in 1707, there was a trade war between Scotland and England. That was one of the main impetus actually for the Act of Union. There was a hard border. There were tariffs on Scottish goods going south of the border. As a farmer, I'm very worried about that. 70% of our beef goes south to England. And I cannot believe, particularly if Scotland applied to rejoin the EU, that there would not be some sort of Scottish backstop, some hard border. From the English side, they would not want EU goods coming in via Scotland without due recognition, or at least possibly tariffs, but also some sort of recording. And on the Scottish side, the EU would certainly not want goods coming from all over the world in through the back door at Gretna or Berwick into the EU. These things need clarifying. And again, it could be clarified by a second vote, a people's vote. If a majority voted for separation, a second vote after the trade negotiations have been concluded, would allow people to vote again to choose whether they really wanted partition and a border at Gretna and at Berwick. And the last question is the obvious one, is the question of the interval between secession votes. It seems, with hindsight, quite extraordinary that the Westminster government, and this I think really was a failing, didn't clarify it at the time in legal terms. It's condemned us to this never-endum that has split communities and families and held back our economy, for failure of businesses to invest, the capital flight that we've seen out of Scotland, the brain drain that we've seen as a result of this never-endum. Clarity on the question of the interval between separation referenda would put a stop to that. Everybody would know there was no point in talking about this issue, as we were not going to address it for another generation. So that's it. Those are the 8 questions for the Clarity Act that the Alliance for Unity is seeking. This is our main effort at the moment to get the 3 Westminster parties to take this seriously, to close down the debate, or at least frame the debate in such a way that everybody knows what would happen in the event of partition. So just to conclude, the Alliance for Unity is going from strength to strength. We are gathering more followers. Please join us if you have not already done so. And please tell your MPs and MSPs that you are behind us, that you support our aims of unifying the pro-union vote, and exhort them to work with us so that we do not go into this election in May with a split vote once again. We can win this, and we need to focus on next spring on a government of national unity in Holyrood and an end to the toxic never-endum and a bright future once again for our country. Thank you.